Yeah, but I want to hear her speak. I'll go soon.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Monica.
Hi, Allie. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today at our ground. So before we start, I'm just going to give us some announcements and some housekeeping rules and everything. So on Thursday at 11:30 in WMST, Dr. Cindy Cruz will deliver a presentation entitled Testimonial as Practice with Vulnerable Populations. Testimonial is the narrative of the dispossessed. In this workshop, Cruz will outline her use of the testimonial as practice with queer homeless youth, noting the genealogy of the genre and its problems and potentials as a new research methodology with vulnerable communities. Also on Thursday at 7 p.m. in Golden Auditorium, Dr. Cindy Cruz will deliver her presentation entitled Notes on the Pedagogy of This Bridge Called My Back. We are also now accepting submissions for the Allegorical Athena, as a literary arts magazine dedicated to issues of gender, sex, sexuality, and intersectionality. You can submit art, writing, or other creative work to wmst@colgate.edu. Also, lastly, our WMST 202 classes are screening films on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Today we're screening La Quinceañera and Mosquita y Mari this Tuesday, so today. And you can also see a schedule on posters in the center, so on some of the pillars and just around the center. Some housekeeping. So if you need to leave during the presentation, please do so quietly and respectfully. There are garbage disposal in the back. It's compost on the left and trash on the right. Also, please clean up your mess. Like, don't leave it. Just help us out a little bit. That'd be great. And if you stay the entire time, if you can help us put back chairs at the end of the presentation, that would be wonderful. Again, thanks for being here. So today we have Professor Nicolae, who will be speaking to us about queer lives and activism in post-socialist Lavinia.
Hello, everyone. Do I actually need this? Can you hear me without it? Yeah. Okay, so if at any point you decide that you can't hear me, I'll pick up the mic again. So, yes, I will be speaking today on new research that I started in Romania, actually last summer, based on interest that I've had for some time. And today I want to bring together this idea of, like, socialism. Why is socialism still important in places like Romania, some 20 years after the revolution? And what does that have to do with LGBT life and activism? What my interest in, and I'm gonna try to keep it more as a story, because I feel like it's preliminary for me. So my background comes into this. How it is that I went about it is very much attached to where my own identity comes from and where my interests are leading me. But from an academic perspective, I'm interested in social movements. My PhD was on social movements in the US, dealing with same-sex marriage. It was my master's work was also in Romania, dealing with social movements among the Roma. So social movements has always been a part of my interest, and how it is that they succeed, and specifically how they start and how they succeed in a transitional space, and specifically in post-socialist context. So what do we mean by post-socialism? What do I mean by post-socialism? I think, adding anything post to something is always creates more of a debate than anything else, right? We understand as being like after something happened, right? After socialism, something has ended. But post does not necessarily mean the end of socialism. It just means a different system that's in place, right? And socialism, socialist ideologies are still a part of the system. So looking at post-socialism for me is looking at what is the legacy of this time period within socialism on the Eastern Bloc, 1948 to 1989, on the kinds of transitions and democratization processes that are taking shape. So what does it mean to be transitional? I think also needs to be complicated also because it's not just a matter of moving from one government one governmental system to another, but it's also moving identities, right? Identities as nations, identities as queer people that's being placed within a global setting. And what it means to be transitional in Europe, it also needs to take into consideration the relationship between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. And those are not just framed by communism, those are pre-communistic as well, right? The kinds of identities that the West has attributed to the East isn't just, it doesn't start with Turkey and India, it actually starts with Eastern Europe as well. And secondly, I was interested in how gender and sexual minority rights were established through different kinds of policies, one human rights policies and grassroots models for organizing. So I started research in Romania as a master's student on the Roma. Right? So this is a huge transitional period for Romania. In 1995, it actually put an application in for the European Union to become a member. And what this means is not that it would get some just favors or benefits of being part of a unified Europe, but it meant that it would also be recognized as a European nation, not as a European other. And that, to me, was really important because I was looking at what does that mean insofar as dealing with minority rights, and so far as dealing with a population, specifically the Roma, that had historically held a marginal position, were a population that were enslaved in Romania until 1869, I believe, and if I remember correctly, and so those things all were coming into effect, right, in the research that I was doing. Other things that were happening was then my own personal search. I think that as scholars, we like to kind of shy away from how it is that our personal identities shape and are shaped by the kinds of research that we do. And I found myself unable to do that as I started working in Romania, the country that I was born in and that I immigrated from in 1984. So in part, in 2000, going back to Romania was also going back to what I thought was going to be my roots, finding aspects of myself there that I didn't feel like I really found or I grew into in the U.S. I moved to the U.S. as a child when I was 10 years old, but as most immigrants, we have like one foot in one culture, one foot in the host culture. So at home, it's very much about being Romanian and holding on to traditions that my parents brought along with them, right, from when they grew up. And then having to also be and define myself as an American. So having the opportunity to go back and do the research in Romania, I felt like this was my chance to kind of bridge these two identities together, to kind of find this missing link that will complete me as a person. And that became a lot harder than I anticipated. So I discovered several things about myself, right? After living in the U.S. for as long as I have, I was more American than I actually thought I was, despite the issues that I felt I was having culturally and the lack of understanding with a lot of my American friends. It turned out that I had adapted the American way of life, in ways that I did not even think about. What also was important is that at this time, in my 20s, I was also experiencing a different kind of identity shift. Right? This is my coming out period, and it was about 6 months prior to my research that I had come out, and and being in Romania at this time turned out to be really turbulent. What was going on, even though I was concentrating on research on Roma rights, parts of my exposure there was always constantly about some kind of talk about queer identity, or what we call queer identity. That's like about homosexuality, to be more specific with the terminology that was being used. Talk shows, different kinds of raves that were being done on the one nightclub in Bucharest. Discussions about the Article 200 of the Romanian Constitution that had been done away with, which I'll tell you guys a little bit about shortly. It was not a safe space, and it was not a good way of actually experiencing being back home and what home meant for me. And so I went from doing highly charged research on the Roma in 2000 to coming to terms with my own sexuality, and that I thought would be a lot easier because I consider myself a feminist. I was teaching in women's studies, and it turned out that the environment that I ended up in was a lot more emotionally charged than I anticipated. So what I ended up doing was changing my research and concentrating on queer rights in the U.S. It was too much for me at that time to actually go, to continue that work. So I find myself now, some 10 years later, wanting to go back and to do this work, still on social movements, still on minority rights, but concentrating on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and in some cadres, queer identities. And so going from one charge, and in the context of Romania, one charge research to another. So I have to ask though, what is queer about Romania? We have a lot of understanding, we have specific understandings about what the meaning of queer means. And so some of that is that it indicates some kind of indeterminacy, right? That people you're indecipherable. Your sexuality or your gender becomes part of a realm where it's not easily defined, right? And we embrace that kind of identification within the context of the U.S. and some Western states. And then it's followed by a body of literature that wants to answer questions that the lesbian and gay studies did to some extent, right? But questioning that idea of what is normal, how does normal come to be, and who's excluded and within those contexts. So it's taking identity that we know as lesbian and gay out of a compartmentalized way of thinking about sexuality, right? And making it more, I guess, for lack of a better term, more fluid in that sense. So you're looking at an array of social codes and forces. How does individual activity and institutional power interact with sexuality, and how does it operate under the rubric of what is natural, which are important questions to ask. But for me, I wondered, do locations and histories of countries like Romania fit that definition of queer? Does it make sense to look at queer identity in this amorphous and fluid way in a country like Romania? So that was my starting question. It's one that I'm still trying to answer. I think in some cases one might think that yes, it makes sense, but when we look at the country as a whole, I'm not sure that it actually does make sense to look at it, to use fluidity in the same way as we think about fluidity in the U.S. So what does it mean to be queer in a post-socialist European context? In order for me to answer that, I decided I wanted to look at the history of sexuality, regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with being lesbian or gay or bisexual or queer identified. How sexuality is being treated in Romania allows us to really understand how sexuality, heterosexuality and homosexuality is understood today. So looking at socialist histories and surveillance mechanisms. And the way I did that was by looking at archival files held by what is known as the secret police in Romania, or loosely called Securitate. And I'll briefly go into some of those shortly. But surveillance mechanisms, like how it is, that the state actually monitored and controlled bodies and ideas and identities about sexuality. The period of transition, right, 1990 to 2005, how those legacies, they start to infiltrate some of the ways in which the nation state gets reconstructed after 1989, the Romanian state, and entry into the European Union. I think all of these things and its position vis-a-vis Europe is really important for Romania. How do we, to be part of the European Union, how do we even define sovereignty as a nation? And I think it becomes more and more problematic for East European countries that are held to a lot higher standards than Western countries in belonging to the Union. So I started by exploring the archival records of the National Archive of the Secret Police, and I also engaged in ethnographic research with different organizations. So I met with the oldest organization, human rights organization, known as that's called Accept, and then with a few other organizations that seem to deviate from the model that's being used by Accept, right, the human rights model, and going into what seemed to be, or what I've termed, a grassroots model. And I think that's also interesting. One of the things that I want to try to do with this research is really understand what does grassroots mean in the context of Romania, and how does that differ between urban spaces and rural spaces in the country. So the council, right, the archival research, the Council for Study of Securitate Archive was empowered in 1999. It's born in 1999, right? And it's there to allow citizens to access the files that the secret police had kept on them. So it's seen as an autonomous government agency that was able to identify secret police officers and informers, which turned out to be very problematic, of pointing fingers at former informers and collaborators, people that when we look at the archive itself, one needs to also question to what extent is this storytelling or is truth telling in the archives. The secret police is established actually in 1948, and as a colleague wisely pointed out, it's also the same year that the Human Rights Declaration is also written up. So it's interesting how these two are kind of happening at the same time. They're set up to keep track of domestic intelligence, monitor counter-sabotage, counter-espionage, protect different kinds of ministers, and most importantly, surveil the populace. So you have telephone tapping, eavesdropping on foreigners and citizens. This is actually using citizens, coercing them into becoming informers, and people would get called in on a weekly, monthly basis, where they would have to, they had no choice but to say something about the people that they were charged to spy on. And you always had mail interception. So if you ever thought that you could write somebody a letter, you were wrong. Like none of that would actually be secret. A year later, the militia then replaced the police. So the militia is actually really important to the secret police, because the secret police is like the KGB of Romania. So the militia then took on the smaller day-to-day monitoring processes. So the security police, the secret police, really wanted to have things that would be deemed a threat to the security of the nation. So if you were part of say, of an occult, if you were suspected of actually spying for a foreign nation, you would be on the radar of the secret police. Or if you were writing, something against the state. So suffice it to say, a lot of records were being kept on different kinds of authors and writers and artists. Right? They're very much a part of their surveillance. And the militia, would deal with the minor infractions. So, for example, if you were caught practicing inversion, sexual inversion, meaning that you got caught in the park, making out, having sex, the militia would actually step in and arrest you, but it wouldn't necessarily mean that it would go to the secret police. And what's interesting about the security is how fast it grew. So in 1948, there were 3,549 agents in a population of about 17 million. By 1984, the population grew to 24 million, and in part that also has to do with the kinds of surveillance that was placed on women, and lack of access to abortion, anti-abortion policies that were created by the state. So you saw a fast increase in the population. But by that time, you have about 23,381 agents. In 1989, supposedly it dropped to 13,000. But what's happening in 1989 is you have a revolution, and files are being burned, and people, top officials are trying to be kept out of the limelight. So that's probably not true that the agents actually, the agency decreased. It's probably still around the same number. And then you have informers, right? A network of informers, and these could be individual citizens. And you can see how drastically it grew from about 42,000 to 507, 100,000 by 1989. So you're creating an environment where you don't know who to trust. You're looking around and you're constantly watching what you're saying. You're constantly watching your facial expressions. You had families informing on one another, close friends informing on one another. So it's an environment of divide and conquer. A complete collapse of the civil society. Right? This is the best way for the Communist Party to maintain its power, its coercive power. That you don't have a civil society to uprise. And the only reason that it led to the uprise is because of what happened in a year earlier in China, and also in other parts of Eastern Europe, where the policies were not as draconian as they were in Romania. So you have a network of informers that the secret police can call on any time, and then the active members that were actually informing on a daily basis were about 100,000. So, to give you a sense of the length of these files, it's not even by page, right, that they're measuring this. They're measuring this in kilometers. And so you have an estimate of 35 kilometers in length of files that have been kept on people. So for us, it would be like 22 miles from here to what, Utica, or with all files that were being kept. Right? So, and every meter contained 5,000 documents. On average, a person's doc would be about 200 pages long. One of so just to give you a sense, one of the people that I talk about, and I don't use names, I'm not interested in names, but rather in the meaning of the surveillance. He was followed for 20 years. And so, the kinds of stress that puts on an individual becomes really apparent as you read on these files. So the connection of this with sexuality is also important. It's in 1936. Right, you have the penal code that's under King Carol II, that says that acts of sexual inversion between men or between women gets up to 2 years of imprisonment if it creates a public scandal. And that's the key here. That starts to change with communism. So pre-communism, there's a ban on homosexuality of any kind, and there is an infraction, but only if it's seen in public, and if it creates some kind of public scandal. In 1968, right, 1965, Nicolae comes into power, and by 1968, he writes in this Article 200 into the Romanian Constitution that takes this law, right, and says, turns it from public to private. Right? So his interest is in growing the nation state. Right? His interest is in creating a powerful Romania, and therefore he needs to control sexuality and reproduction. Homosexuality, as a result, it doesn't matter whether or not it is done in public or in private. If it comes into the purview of the knowledge of the nation, of the secret police, of the militia, you would automatically get up to 7 years of imprisonment. And the last person to actually suffer under this, under this law is this woman, Mariana Cetățeanu, who in 1995, right, well after the fall of communism, was accused by another woman of hitting on her, and she was jailed for it. She became a case for Amnesty International, who after a few years was released as a result of being taken on by Amnesty International. But of course, during that time, she suffered a great deal of abuse in prison. So ultimately, sex begins to belong to the nation. And so what I did is I ended up being able to look at 5 files. So it does not sound like much, but remember, every file is about 200 pages long, and I had a month. And it's also written, right? Like you have handwritten notes and everything. And so it's interesting. So one of the cases that at first, I would laugh through until I wanted to cry about it, because this one man was accused of being a pervert. He was accused of being part of the occult, and he was also accused of inciting inversion and perversion among the young population. Okay, so basically what this guy was into he was into yoga, he was into tantra, and he just liked pornography. And so he would write to anybody that would listen and would be willing to send pornographic materials to him in Romania. At the time, in the 80s, right, and in the 70s, the West, one of the ways in which the West tried to get a hold of the civil society in Romania was to create pen pals. So you would have a friend that's in the U.S. or a friend that's in Germany or anywhere in the world that was a democracy, and you would write back and forth, and you would tell each other about your lives in your respective places. So this guy, is writing all over the place to magazines, wants to be put on different kinds of lists to gain more and more pen pals, wants to have videos and all kinds of paraphernalia. So he gets on the radar. He gets on the radar of the secret police, not because to say that he's a pervert, but because his perversion is seen as leading him to talk against the nation. So homosexuality was, or sexuality, right? And he's a pervert. At first, you can't tell if he is queer or if he's not. Right? But in either case, he's seen as somebody that, through the improper use of sexuality, he's talking negatively about the nation. And he's also, yoga was actually considered an occult. It was banned in Romania because it taught a certain kind of ideology and way of looking at the world. Other, two other files that I looked at was when a young artist who pretty much seems like, from what I gather, like was gay identified, and he was forced to actually become a spy, right, for the security, the secret police, with an American ambassador. So his job was to sexually make sexual passes at the ambassador, who was believed to be homosexual, and then to try and get information from him for the secret police. And then, of course, after that, they also tried to get him to do similar things with other Romanian citizens. And that's also something that ended up breaking him to the point that the agents themselves, the secret police agents, said, let's take him out of the informant and collaborator role because this guy is falling apart. Another agent, and writer and artist, right? He has, he's now passed away, but he was, he had the code name Anton, and Anton had spied on basically every artist and writer that that was part of the underground, of Romania. So some of these things you can say, like he's writing, if you can actually read the initial guy, like what he's writing to pretty much the same letter to everyone. So he writes, "I am a young man from Romania. I am 19 years old. I share a great sympathy for the German people. I like also the German erotic articles. In your sexy articles, I can to see the free moral comprehension of the sexuality in Germany." So he pretty much starts off every letter, like whether he's writing to Americans or he's writing to Swedes or Germans, whoever it is, like he starts off like about his appreciation for the sexual freedom that exists in their countries. So then he begins to ask, to ask for things like sexy photos, sexy slides, sexy magazines, everything under of being sexy. What ends up happening, right, is that he then gets banned from, because of the secret police, gets banned from his jobs. He's not able to hold down a job, and what happens in the context of communism in Romania, when you don't have a job, you face the threat of actually being thrown into a work camp. So you're either continue to become an informant for the secret police, or you get thrown into a work camp, or you go deep underground. And so he ended up going deep underground. He was never an informant. All of this was being kept on him, like that, through interception of his mail and by using other people to get information about him. So, some of the things that were written in there about him. By the end, this is by 1980 something. Right? This starts in the 70s and 1980s, or he's at this point that he's intensifying his preoccupation with gaining material pornography. Right? So what's happening also is that people are getting, by the 1980s, Ceausescu becomes extremely paranoid and intensifies his surveillance, and people are starting to get a little bit restless, and so it seems like this is in reaction to also what's happening. The more that the system is trying to gain a hold on him, the more he's trying to break away. So I mentioned that, what ends up happening here is how do you read these archives? Do you read them as being truth, as what is written, whether it's by the informers themselves, as them actually telling the truth about the people that they're spying on? The agent Anton, for example, he's also a writer, right? And so whether or not he is able to collect anything, and for after some years, people are becoming aware that what he's doing is informing, and so he's trying to then start to make up some stories. So part of what's in these archives also have to be read as construction, right? That they have to say something, and so they're making things up. And sometimes it's made things up to protect and some identities and move the focus away from certain people. And other times, people are human beings, so if you piss them off, they might write something crappy about you. And so that ends up being part of it. And in either case, it ends up destroying lives. It ends up destroying individual lives, and again, it destroys any kind of cohesiveness of the of civil society. So that brings us kind of to today. So I have this up here, and this is coming from the young artist who, and from the excerpt of him actually being recorded as he's seducing and being seduced by the ambassador. And so I have this up because I want to pinpoint the redaction. I think that's also something that's interesting and becomes ethnographic information. Part of when I went there and did the work in the archive, I literally thought I'm just gonna sit there and just sift through records and pages. And what ended up happening actually is getting a lot of information about how society thinks about or people in authority think about homosexuality or sexuality today, also in relation to protection of identity. And so there's several things where I work here. One was I had to have a meeting with the director, and I said I'd like to get copies, of some of these files, and he said, of course, we're just going to have to go through them and redact. So I said, yeah, that's fine. As I wrote to you, I'm not interested in people's names or birthplaces, anything of that sort. And he said, no, that's not what we're going to do. That's not the only thing we'll be looking at. We want to make sure that the information in there is not sensitive. So that's where the conversation kind of stalled for me. I'm like, okay, what do you mean it's not sensitive? How will you define sensitive, and who's going to decide whether or not information is sensitive? And that's where he explained that they have a group of archivists who will look at this, and they will make those decisions. Right? So at this point, the decisions about whether or not a particular discussion about sexuality is sensitive is left up to personal interpretation, that's then translated into a protection of privacy of individuals, whether or not they're passed away, and also in relation to some of the problems that the archive had initially, where they themselves did not worry about protection of privacy, and they released names that was illegal for them to do, of people that were considered to be collaborators and informers, without actually thinking critically about the archives themselves. So now, they're trying to undo those problems, and they're trying to, in some ways, compensate and make sure that they don't, that they do protect, the individuals. Now, as far as I know, the ambassador that's being written about is long gone, but you have these kind of redaction, and this was about 5 pages long. Starting from here to the end of page 5, it's all gone. Right? So this was considered to be sensitive information because it was, recording of actual, sex and discussions about sex between two men. However, when looking at the files from the guy that was into yoga and was interested, actually was heterosexual, and even talked about doing a sex tape with 2 other women, the only ones that were actually redacted were the women that are still alive. The other ones' identities are still there. Right, and information about them is still there. So to me, it's like that's information about what kind of sexuality is considered sensitive, and what does that actually even mean for it to be sensitive. And I think that has a lot to do with the kind of ideas about sexuality that are rooted in not just in the communist past, but mostly in religion and the religious makeup of Romania, and also in the distrust that was created during the communist era. So part of the reason why this idea of grassroots doesn't even come into effect until about 2010 is because most people could not even look at each other and trust one another that they can create any kind of organization well into the 2000s. So there was a lot of reliance on human rights models, and so that's how the organization Accept comes into being. And they're relying on being professional, and rather than creating community, right? There's a presumption of what the community is and what it needs, and they will act on behalf of that community. So there was a focus on legal change and using the policies of entrance into the European Union to gain those legal changes, like to overthrow Article 200 from the Romanian Constitution. And so I also have your nationalism versus national identity, and it's most of the politicians will talk about national identity, but the idea of nationalism, right, that sense of being Romanian or sense of being wherever gets put on the purview of religion. That it is, Romania comes into existence as a country based on its religious past, and that's the gift that it inherits from the Roman Empire. So the Orthodox Church is always holding on to that. It's like that's the purview. Like this idea of being Romanian belongs to religion, and it begins to use it, and after 1989 as a way to actually gain a hold of, get a political say. So I look at this, to use like a quote by William Faulkner, the past is not dead, it is not even the past. And it's never, and I said it's never actually the past, in part because the legacies, you can look at, any kind of legacy as having an impact today, but also because the European Union, the West, will not let go of that legacy either. Right? It continues to other the Eastern Bloc, and that it can never truly have a complete foot into the Western area. But it's religion, that Lavinia's fan of political sciences writes, like, that rises phoenix-like from the ashes of communism throughout Eastern Europe. During communism, especially in Romania, religion is banned. Any kind of denomination is banned, but the Orthodox Church is kept under the purview of the security police, the secret police, right? So the priests themselves are then supposed to actually inform on their parishioners. They're being seen as collaborators, and they're not supposed to actually, and they don't, right? It comes to a point where they don't actually talk against the nation state. So it becomes an important part of the historical narrative, right? That this communist repression of religion. So freedom of religion gains more and more power in Romania. Kind of just from the makeup of the religious makeup of Romania. 87% are Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox. So the Romanian Orthodox Church, gains a lot of power. So in post-communism, they start to create political partnerships with different kinds of leaders, with aspiring presidents. And so they have a lot of say in who's going to actually be the president and what kinds of policies are going to be put in place. Priests, get actively involved in elections from the pulpit, but they also begin to create their own party and start to be gain seats in the parliament. So this is kind of problematic when you have the church actually holding parliamentary seats, and and it gives credence to organizations like the Alliance of the Family, Pro-Life Association, and more association, different kinds of organizations that are anti-homosexuality and anti-abortion. But homosexuality gets particularly focused on because during the communist period, the anti-abortion laws were so harsh, right? And they're so draconian that afterward the church would not dare actually tell the people that that abortion should remain illegal. That would have never flown with the population. So abortion is not illegal. So they focus their attention as a result of that until they feel like they're ready to address pro-life, which happens mostly in the rural areas. They're focusing on the heterosexual family in the context of activism. So they're really building on the religious base to create particular kind of sentiments. So you don't have to read all of these, but in 2012 there was a survey that was done where trying to get like the perceptions and attitudes against minorities in Romania. 54% stated that they would never have a meal with a homosexual, and 63% stated that they would be bothered if a same-sex person would try to make advances towards them. A similar survey was done by a different organization where about 80% of people that were questioned said that they would not want a homosexual as a neighbor, and 53% prefer that would be outlawed, even though it dropped from 2006 where it was about 60 to 62%. So, except when it came into the picture, it's like, you know, it focused and it continues to focus on creating legal change. It cannot, however, get away from what happens on the ground. So, for example, in 2013, there was the LGBT History Month, and there was a film screening in front of one of the museums in Bucharest, and they screened The Kids Are All Right. Now, by U.S. standards, right, that's probably one of, like, I don't know, vanilla kind of movies you can see about sexuality and queer identity, but it incited a lot of right-wing militants who started verbally assaulting filmgoers, who were carrying banners that were actually using slogans, 1930s slogans, fascist slogans from Romania, that I can't remember exactly which was the slogan, but it was pretty much like utilizing legionnaire or fascist rhetoric. So just bringing out a lot of the neo-Nazis in the area, and then starting to sing the Romanian national anthem and starting to chant like as if they were in church. So bringing those two together becomes really prominent, right? And as if that people that are queer cannot actually be also Orthodox. They can't have both. They can be either Romanian or religious. So even though it is now part of the European Union, Romania falls pretty short of most countries that, internationally, that actually give protections, adequate protections to gay and lesbian populations. So out of this, you start to get new kinds of activism. And so part of this is one organization known as Transform that is deals with transgender individuals, right? Whereas Accept talks about transgender, it actually does not really do much insofar as legislation is concerned for transgender population, and bringing these two together. So you have what are considered to be more radical organizations, as well as bringing in something that it was impossible for Accept to even conceptualize in the mid-90s and early 2000s, this idea of the collective. If you said collective to people that are from, that experience communism, all they heard was, now your property belongs to the state and you don't have a voice. And so collective here is trying to translate and create a whole new meaning for it that organizations like Transform are trying to do. So, utilizing what we call grassroots models. But to understand grassroots models, you have to understand, how does something like this continue to incite fear for some people, even today. And ultimately, and so I'm like going back to this idea of queer, where you do start to see some questioning of things like, binaries, discussions about being transgender, but people don't even know, like, they have to actually leave the country in order to get any kind of surgery for transitions. But organizations like Mosaic are supposed to be the radical organizations. They're the ones that are supposed to bring in this idea of queer, and they are. They're really bringing in a lot of discourse that is happening in the U.S. and in Western Europe. But those remain really small cliques, and it's not quite clear for like what kind of sense it makes for people that live in a small town in the middle of Romania, right? For whom homosexuality is still talked about as inversion. How do you get from discussion inversion to discussing queer? So, I leave it here because it's like this is extremely preliminary, and this is the kind of information that I'm looking to analyze and think about from the point of view of non-governmental organizations, but also from lived reality. So, thank you. I'm not sure we have any minutes left. Anybody have any questions?
Okay. All the stuff that you're bringing up about nationalism and sort of national identity associated with religion being used against it. And then at the very end, you talked a little bit about how discourse is used in the West. I guess I would love to hear a little bit more about, in some ways, are these groups playing into the stereotype that if you write all this stuff, it's porn. That if you're sort of coming in here, this is how they do it in the United States, or this is how they do it in Western Europe. How is this about sort of a globalized, transnational, or westernized understanding of queerness that in some ways, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, I think it's very easy when we sit in the U.S. to be like, well, of course they together and they get it all right. And as somebody who is studying non-governmental organizations in China, I hear them say that to you have no clue what we're doing something different, but it's actually working. We're using a language that actually makes sense here. You don't get to come here and tell us how we're supposed to think. So I kind of wonder if you could talk a little bit more about these groups, both in terms of, do they see themselves as part of the political movement and as part of that movement, or are they trying to find ways in which to make a movement that makes sense for their society that may or may not be the movement that we need to see?
Yeah. Well, like I said, this is like I had 1 month. Right. So in the information that I got within that 1 month, my initial impression is that this extremely youth-driven movement, right? It's coming from, not from Accept, right, but from the other grassroots organizations. And they are building a lot, they are using a lot of the rhetoric that we hear in the West. So I think they are buying into that, right? And they want to, and they're thinking about like, they're talking about themselves, like, even in some conversations from like, I'm white, what do I understand about non-white people's experiences? Which is, great realization, but we're, talking about a country. When you start to adopt this kind of language, are you talking about yourself vis-a-vis the Roma? Or are you talking yourself about vis-a-vis the experiences of other ethnicities in other countries? So I don't think that it's clear. And the same thing with ideas about sexuality and queerness, that they're kind of throwing around a lot of words that and ideas that, you know, that make sense within the concept of their idea of actually belonging to your community. So I think part of, you know, to answer poorly that question is that it's not just about we're going to do things differently when they're trying to actually be seen as European, right? So China doesn't have that extra component, right? They're saying like we're going to do things differently. Places like Romania, even the young generations, do want to be seen as being, you know, European and having that status. So I think all of those somehow come together. I am interested to see, you know, more like as they grow, like if they start to deviate, because I don't think it quite makes sense. Like the communities are really small right now. Any other questions?
What is your, like, when you go back, what is it that you want to look at next for next?
Oh, next steps, yes. So the next steps, I think, like one of the things that came out of this that I did not talk here because it's so preliminary, even more preliminary, is the notion of health. I wanted to look at how does the idea about like sexuality come in with notions about health and access to health care for queer identified or like lesbian and transgender and gay identified individuals. I also want to look at, because this was very much centered in Bucharest, and Bucharest has this history of actually being, at one point it was called Little Paris, and so it kind of also shows the desire to be seen as Western. What happens when you move outside of that, even if you go into smaller cities, not just necessarily rural areas, but what happens if you go into Iași or Transylvania? Like, do things start to move away from that? Do we start to see a little more variation in identification? Okay, well, thank you so much.